Hello, I'm Carrie Forney, and I'm joined with
Kelly Christenberry. Hi.
and we are looking forward to spending a few minutes with you in order to give you an overview of the Alveary High School program. We're very excited to be able to show you some of the books that are coming up for next year, and just to talk a little bit about how the high school program is put together and some of the thoughts and ideas that are behind that. So to kind of start that off, we were just a minute talking about how the excitement of the high school years, where we're really seeing the growth of students' relationships with these various subjects, these various topics, and the things, the books and the things that Mason talks about that have been a part of their education all the way along. And now as they get into the high school years, how that's just broadening and deepening, and there's so many different ways that these relationships are playing out in their lives and how they're interacting with these ideas. And so just how things are the same as they've been, but also different, because these ways of going about the learning is deepening and growing. So one example being how the relationship of what they're doing with books. Mason talks about in her third volume on school education, just that there are multiple ways that we use books. It's not just the idea of reading something and telling back. That's certainly the underpinning, but as we get into these upper years, there's whole ideas of following an argument through a writing, or looking at how a cause and effect is played out, or giving various descriptives of what's happening in an essay. So there's all sorts of ways that has grown and developed throughout these high school years. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, and as students have grown, right, they're maturing, and so the program is maturing with them. That's what happens. We kind of progressively learn, and so that's what happens in high school. And as they begin to do that growing and learning more, it's a progression towards more self-education, and that's where we're going with that. And so being able to utilize these books in ways that help them mature and integrate some of the knowledge that is based on what they've learned before and coming forward, it just deepens more. And so that's an exciting thing to see that. So we're looking forward to sharing some of the ways it happens. One of the things that Carrie and I were talking about is that's important, that's different in the high school years, is that the lesson plans that these books talk about, these lesson plans are directly written to the student. So the teacher is involved. You're still the teacher, and the classroom teacher is able to manage through all of that. The homeschool teacher is able to manage through all of that, but the student is responsible for their learning. And so that begins to show up more and more in the high school years.
Right. Yeah. And that's exciting too, because that's a process, right? And students are going to go through that at different rates and different ways, but the lesson plans are there to support them as they go through that process. So it's an exciting time. And we're excited to show you some of the books. We're going to go through the subjects. We've got piles here around us, and we will work through them sort of subject by subject, and just thinking through, okay, how does this fit into the larger whole of what we're really excited, these different ideas that are going to be coming forth through these various books. So we wanted to start off with architecture. That's a subject that is kind of going along parallel with history in some ways, but also has sort of an engineering focus too. So one way that first goes along with the history, the ninth graders this next year will be reading a book called Thomas Day, and how he was an African-American furniture maker, which kind of brings us from our this last time period, going through the colonial years, and right up now up to the 1800s, and thinking through, okay, what's happening to architecture at this time? What are some of these different areas of the country? how is that playing out? What does it look like? So there's some great illustrations. It's just a fascinating story of this man's life and what he had to face as a free Black man who was working as a furniture maker. And he was a very amazing, prominent, well-known furniture maker. And what was his life like? So we kind of get to walk in his shoes and sort of see how that architecture of the time, because he was involved in not just furniture, but also mantles and lintels, and how that affected the house designs at the time as well. So that's one of the 9th grade books. They have a couple other ones that deal more on the engineering side, that talk about rivers and the canal systems that we're developing, as well as something on the Statue of Liberty, because that's a monument, right? So we've got whole kind of the broad spectrum of what architecture means. And then in the grades 10 and 11, Kelly's got the book there called Why Buildings Stand Up. So those students, that's kind of one of those ones that doesn't change by the time period as much. There's somewhere along this, in the rotations, students will go through that as more of the structural engineering, understanding what's behind buildings and how they're built and why they're built that way. So that's kind of, it's historically chronological throughout the book. So they're still getting a historical look at it, but it also brings in the structural engineering piece as well. And then the 12th graders are going to read a more in-depth book on Thomas Day that has just some fascinating, really great pictures of what some of his work looked like and how that was fleshed out at the time. So really excited about that. This is a new book that I just found recently, and looking forward to the students really enjoying that.
Harry, I like the way you're showing how the day book in grade 9, also you have something that would be more appropriate for a 12th grader. So they're going through the same time frames, and it shows up in some of the books in a younger version or an older version, or a more mature version in content. So I like the way that shows up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and the different rotations change based on what we're studying in history and what is possible and what books are available. So that kind of, you can see that progression just through the rotation as well, the different types of books that we can use. So for shifting into art, students will follow the same picture study, and there's additional questions that are in there that Erin has added for the older students as they progress in their art lessons, the actual making of art. It coordinates then with what's asked of them in the picture study, right? So they're starting to bring these art techniques and understanding into what they can see in the picture and how they can communicate about that and interact about it, like what's happening and what do they see. So that's all the same set of lesson plans. It just has that additional component for the older students in it. The book that we added that the high school students will read is a poetic fictionalized biography of one of the she's a sculptress, Edmonia Lewis, and her life, kind of how did she come to be making these sculptures that we're going to be studying in the picture study. So it's just a fascinating book to get kind of behind the scenes, even being fictionalized, because we don't know that much about her life. So, the researcher did a great job of taking what we do know and really trying to fill in some of the unknowns and to give us a picture of who she was as a person and why she ended up making the types of sculptures that she did, and how did she go about learning those skills, and what was it like to navigate those times with trying to become someone who was wanting to give these gifts to the world, right? So it's just a fascinating read, and it's something that even teachers of younger students can read and share appropriate parts. It's a hard story a lot of ways too, so it has definitely one that you might want to pre-read too, as depending on your student. So, but definitely one not to miss as far as how to really engage not only with the picture study components, the sculpture studies, but who is this person who is making these things? So fascinating read. All right, so that gets us to Bible.
Bible. Okay, so there's a lot to cover with Bible. There's a lot of different areas that you might not be aware of. So we just want to talk through those a little bit. And actually, I want to start with grade 9 because there's something unique that we're doing here with grade 9. This book, it's for Bible history. Now, you've had Bible history all along, and it continues to be used in Bible lessons. But this is a dedicated lesson on God's big picture, and it takes you through the Old and New Testaments, and it's read all year long, so that you can go through and look at the different places about what's happening and why it's happening, and be able to put this in an overarching view. So we have this in 9th grade as a basis for continuing on. Mm-hmm. So then we also have just our Bible readings. Of course, we do this chronologically, and we are continuing from last year. So we're in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and there's selected Psalms that kind of fit in there with all of that. But we also have the prophets that fit in with those. And so those are assigned along with Bible history. And we use this because if you're not familiar with chronology and how you're reading the Bible, it's hard to fit those prophets in when you don't know where they are. And so this is a really good help. We use it in the younger years as well for a teacher resource, and then for grade 7 and 8. And it has some different things. I think Jen had mentioned even in the younger years, it has timelines and a list of how those things, how the scriptures go in order, because even some of the books are out of order in the timelines. And so this is a really big help for that, for the student and for the teacher. We use this as well. We recommend this as a study Bible. You can use any Bible that you want, and it comes in different translations. This is an NIV. If you don't want that, there's other ones as well. But it's a cultural background study Bible. It is not a commentary. It contains the scripture, but it also goes through and has notes along the bottom, and those are cultural notes. It's not telling you an interpretation of the passage, but it gives you the historical background. And there are extra things in here that talk through, okay, at this time frame, this is a piece of information that might help you set the context in its history, or give you some information about the archaeology or cultural practices. So it's really a cultural study Bible that helps you view more of the scripture that you're reading from that actual culture that it's set in, right? So sometimes we appropriate our culture and put it into other things and see it a different way. And this will help students and teachers be able to kind of look through that and avoid that problem. So let's see, as students are studying grade 9, there's a 3-year rotation from 7, 8, and 9. And so grade 9 continues on, and they're doing the same things. But the New Testament that they're studying is Acts this year. And so this is a commentary. Students in grade 9 are beginning to learn to use commentaries. Mm-hmm. And so as they're doing that, this is a specific commentary. We don't always use the same one or by the same author. We focus on a couple of different ones, but depending upon what the year is and what they're studying, we change those out. You're welcome to use a commentary of your faith tradition too. This is just a really good one that will help bring to life some of those things where your student is interested. They can choose what to read out of this. It doesn't come every day what they do. As they move forward and get older, there are commentaries that are assigned. Of course, you can always substitute, but we do use a lot of the Wiersbe ones. This is a series that we use called Be Faithful, or the B series. And this year, because they're reading through, the 10th and 11th graders are reading through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And let's see, then they continue on it, but there's different commentaries that will show them as they go through 1st and 2nd Peter and 1st through 3rd John and Jude. So some of these will be specifically available for those to use for a commentary that's specific. As the students get older, they are doing different things for New Testament. Most of them stay along the same rotation for Old Testament, except for the 12th graders, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute when I show you the commentary for that. But the other commentaries that we use as a possibility are, okay, so when they study Hebrews as a senior, then they'll be able to use this or choose a different one. So they have Ephesians and Romans as well that they study through throughout the year, and they're assigned by turn. And so you'll see them in the lesson plans. They're assigned. It tells you how to use them and how not to use them, and making sure that the scripture is the focus of things. The last thing I want to tell you about that is this one is a commentary that we use for the Psalms, because in grade 12, the term 3 is always a study in Psalms, the Psalms of Ascent. And they studied Psalms all along, but they haven't put it in this specific context. And so it's a really good way. There's a lot of integration of other resources in there as well. But this is one that they use, either this or St. Chrysostom is another one that they can choose if you'd like, and it's on the program as well. But it guides them through alongside the lesson plans. Okay, so this one is Unearthing the Bible. It's one that we've added to fill out that church, the Bible history as we move forward. It's always integrated in there, and this has some archaeology that you'll see. It's a brief description and information about each one. So depending upon which books we're reading, it'll be assigned within the lesson. So you'll be able to see those things alongside there. So this. Yeah. Go ahead,
We're
Karen.
really excited about being able to have a book like this in the curriculum, because going through the programs of what Mason did, she always had some sort of Bible archaeology type book, right? And this was the time period when things were just coming to light. There was so many archaeological digs, and they were finding things, and she was kind of living at that sort of peak moment when that was first happening. And so she had books in the curriculum that were pointing out things that were being discovered. So it's just kind of it's a really neat sort of piece of the curriculum to be able to continue that with, well, what's been found since, and what do they understand now, right? It's sort of that bringing it into the 21st century. It's just a really clear way to see where this is happening. Like here, these are the books that Mason was using, but that was based on what they understood at the time. And now we've got books like this that are coming out now that there's been a lot more digging and a lot more understanding of what's happened and how those pieces go together, and helping us to sort of bring the Bible to light. And that same thing that Mason was doing back then, she was trying to help the students to see these are real things and here's how it comes to light. And we're doing the same thing now, but on a book that is just brought that right up to the current moment. So it's really exciting to be able to do that.
Yes, yes. Well, and just looking at the programs that Mason had, there was the Bible lessons, and the Bible subject overall was so much more full than we think of when we just say, okay, read the scripture, here's the Bible, and maybe add a few archaeology things into it. It was so much more that she considered part of a full program. They were doing things at different times because it was part of their culture at different times. They were doing catechisms, and they would have the liturgical year was part of a common thing that they understood and knew and practiced. So as they were going through those things, Mason included all of those in the program and expected it. So as we're moving through these, that's where all these are coming together as part of what Mason did as a full Bible program. It's amazing how all this comes together. One of the things that she also did was she used church history and brought that in. And we used 2 different books for that on a regular rotation. The Bruce Shelley one, this is the new edition of Church History in Plain Language. And it actually is in pretty plain language. This comes in as well, and we do a few chapters at a time, as well as the Catholic Church to the Ages. Both of these are about church history, and that's their focus. It's not a theological focus. And so it rounds out the picture really well when you use these in concert, and they're really, you need to use them both together. We also have other things that help with church history and understanding what's happening at the time frame, because we study chronologically, and then we're pulling those things in. That's where those chapters come in. We also have this year and next year a book called When the Church Was Young, and it's a collection of biographies. They're shorter biographies of fathers of the church, the early saints, and who those people were made a difference into what was going on all around them and today. So that these short biographies will be used as part of church history this year as well. Okay. We mentioned there were other things going on, like the catechisms and the Book of Common Prayer, you probably are aware of. The church readings were part of something that were included, and some of these were done privately or as a family. Mason assumed that students were doing, at this point, a personal study. They were reading the Bible for themselves and having their own personal time, aside from Bible lessons that were assigned. So if your student is unfamiliar with that, we have a suggestion. The Habits of Grace is one of the suggestions we put in the program to help your students say, okay, what am I supposed to be doing by studying scripture by myself? What am I looking for? How do I go about doing it? And so that's a good resource. Please feel free to use another one that you might know of and prefer. That's just one of our suggestions. The prayer is an important part, and that was assigned in the lessons. And we have two different examples. You can use different ones, just like you could choose your catechism that you would like to use. This one's called Divine Hours, and there are 3 different ones depending upon the season. It follows the liturgical church year. So as you're going through each season, so as you're coming up to Advent, as you're going through the set prayers is something that more liturgical denominations practice, and we still do today. So if you're part of that, you'll be familiar with it. If you're not, here's another new resource. This just came out. Carrie, you want to tell them about this? It's amazing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It takes that same idea of, let's just say you're not familiar with doing any sort of personal study, and you're wanting to build that habit or start that tradition of your own. This book is set up on a 31-day kind of rotation. Like it has a plan that you can work through sort of every month. And you're starting to learn those patterns. Like it has prayers, it has a little bit of a catechism reading, it has an Old Testament and New Testament reading. It's got just some of the creeds of the church, right? It sort of brings many of those things that we've been talking about together into one book. And it sort of, you just work your way through it in the 31 days, and then you start back over because the readings are going to continue as you do it. So you can use it as a continuous sort of model month to month. And it's very doable. It's not you're not reading for hours, right? It's just a short little bit. You can get through it and, reasonably in 15, 20 minutes. It's not a long drawn out thing. So yeah, very helpful, very sort of basic, but still rich, like really gives you something to think about for the day. And that's really what I've appreciated about it the most, I think.
Yeah. And it's, I like the way it's titled A Liturgy for Daily Worship, because that's really what these things are about. It's about using scripture and worshiping, because you read the Old Testament and New Testament and maybe some Psalms and each thing. It's really bringing that forward. Yeah. So those are some great options for you to use for church readings.
Yeah, and just a question or a comment on that too, right? Like, don't feel overwhelmed, right? Like if you as a teacher are coming from a situation where just reading an Old Testament passage and a New Testament passage is that's maybe the extent of what you've done, this can feel really overwhelming, right? Because it's like, wait a minute, like there's prayers and there's resources for archaeology and commentaries. Like it can quickly feel like, wait, how come we're doing so many things, right? So don't feel like this is a requirement in the sense of, all right, you've got to go from a 10-minute thing to an hour and a half, right? As though you're adding 10 more books to the program, right? It's not, so don't view the categories and the number of books as somehow you just got a dump truck loaded on you, right? But view it more as these are the growing relationship, kind of like we started at the beginning, right? Your students are their relationship with the Bible, with God, obviously is growing and developing and expanding. This is like the widening of the funnel, but every student's going to be at a different place in there. So they might not all be ready, right, for these same things at the same time, but we're providing the sort of the categories so that you can see as a teacher, well, what's the next step that's appropriate for your students, right? Like take these as the kind of the guidance of where does that funnel lead you next. And so that's our hope, is that you start to see, oh, wow, like this is such a broad area of study. And there are so many facets, and it's going to really bring all of these pieces to life as you can sort of see where you could layer things on and add things in as is appropriate for your students, your classroom.
And remember that it's not all in the morning lessons, right?
Right.
So part of this is about growing as a person and in life. It's your daily practices. Reading scripture is a daily practice. And so that's part of how that fits in. It's not do this lesson, do this lesson, do this lesson with all of these books. It's how does it fit into a growing Christian life?
And that's a great point, Kelly, for just the whole program as a whole, right? Like we're at this point, Mason is viewing these things as this is really preparing your students for life. And so in this subject, as in many others, when we get to literature, right, we're going to talk about books that are on the list that they're not all supposed to be going in between just 9 to 12, right? Like I think sometimes we have that idea of like, oh, well, the school's time is here, and so everything's got to get packed in there. But Mason is viewing it as a life, and we're following in that footsteps of we're providing the resources and the opportunity to grow in all those directions. And it is really like, I love the option of, oh, well, this could be a book that I read at night. And this one might be something that, I read on weekends, right? Whatever it might be, there's ways to incorporate that into students' lives, that it becomes those habits that they're really going to take with them as they go forward into life.
And they don't set aside a time for this is a learning time and this is a different time, right? That's part of whole life. And so whether you're in a classroom and you go home, or whether you're at home and you're still at home, but you kind of close the doors, that's not the way life works. And so it's a whole picture of that. So yeah, thanks for putting that out, Carrie. That's really all right. So I think that means that we can move on into citizenship. That's our next topic. And we're not going to go through a whole lot for grade 9 because you're already familiar with our set book ourselves. It is something that is continued from grade 7 and 8 and 9 all follow the same rotation for book 1, and then grades 10 and 11 continue with reading book 2. So you'll be familiar with that one. It's a really important book if you haven't used it before. It's written directly to the student. It's the only one Mason wrote directly to the student, and it really helps them think through what does it mean to be a person and made in the image of God, and how do I live out for His service. So I think that's a really important book to continue using. And all of citizenship is really like that, because you don't take just one thing and say, okay, well, this is related to Christian and this is not. It's really about how we serve the Lord and others in our life. And as you move through citizenship, one of the things that as you're getting in the older grades, so we have ourselves and Plutarch, which you're familiar with, and then no, that's not it. What's the next one? Sorry. Oh yeah, so the Plutarch also is you're using Julius Caesar, which is part of the time frame that matches ancient history this year. So you'll see those things in grade 9, and as you move up to grade 10 and 11 and 12, actually they share this, and it is a book that brings back from what we're reaching back from what we learned last year. And we are moving forward into, okay, so we learned all about how the nation was established and the Revolutionary War and how we came to be the United States. And this helps students look through and say, okay, what does it mean today? What does it mean for me to be a citizen? and how does that impact what I do, and how I impact my community. So it's a really good one for that. And that's in terms 1 and 2 this next year for grades 10, 11, and 12. They share that one. Not always the case. This year, that's the way that works. Let's see. In grade 10, the term 3, I want to introduce you to this one. This is Alveary. They're a collection of essays. It says home economics. It's not home economics or economics. It is about how to be a citizen, how we live and have relationship with the world and our place in that world with the earth, with the community, with those things. And so these essays are things that the students will read partly through this year and probably through next year as well. Grade 10 for this one. Grade 11 it has an actual economics book that they begin. It's an introduction to economics. It's a great new find. I'm really excited about this one. Carrie has this one to show you. It's yeah, see, here it is. What would Keynes do? So if you're not familiar with economics, John Maynard Keynes is a prominent economist. That theory is based upon some of the things that he's come up with. But it doesn't just talk about Keynes. It talks about all the other players in there. And that's just the title of it. But that's the ideas behind it, how to introduce students to ideas of economics, and things like markets and trade-offs and all kinds of things that you come up against when you begin talking about economic theory. And how does it relate to their world today? What does that mean to them, and how can they understand at a normal everyday life way? In grade 12, we move on in economics still, and this is in first and second term. This way, there you go. Economics 1 lesson. It is a classic book. It's by Hazlitt, and it goes through chapter by chapter, lesson by lesson, and it talks through the ways that the economy works. What does it mean when you raise rent? How does that affect inflation? How does it impact the ways of how you can buy things? And the chapters are pretty easily done one at a time. It goes through the whole term, and it brings forward things about taxes and credit and price fixing and minimum wage law. So there's a lot of topics in here that as a teacher, you'll want to talk to your students about this and discuss these things in groups and be able to determine how you see that in your world today. That's an important piece of being in your world today. The other part of citizenship is current events. One last book we talk about that really quick is this is always used in term 3 for grade 12. It is a book called Conscience, What It Is, How to Train It, and Loving Those Who Differ. It's got some really important concepts about who we are as people, it's written from a Christian perspective. And so it has scripture in here. What does that mean to act out in life in your community? So you see a lot of this continued theme about living in community, living in relationship with others. And that's a really important part about how do you deal with your conscience and when it tells you something different, and where do you go to find out what that means? How do you calibrate it with scripture? How do you relate to fellow Christians when your conscience disagrees? How you should relate to people in other cultures when your conscience disagrees? Mm-hmm. So it's got some really broad and important topics for seniors to go through and for you to talk about with your students. So that this is one of my favorite books.
Yeah, and that's also a great example too of how at this point in the programs going through the years, topics and subjects are starting to overlap a lot more, right? Like we don't just, if you were to look at a single line of say just citizenship even, you would miss the richness of recognizing how these things go and dovetail so well with our history studies, with some of the things happening in literature, right? Obviously, you just mentioned how that ties in with Bible, right? There are, it's not this, it's kind of always reminds me, it's the the sum total, right, of the subjects is it's more, or the sum is much greater than the addition of its parts, right? Like there's a richness that's happening now. And obviously it happens in the younger years too, because of these overlapping things. But I think you really start to see it in these different topics in a way that is unique for the high school years. There is a history is weighing in on what's happening in economics, and economics is showing what's going on and has developed in history too, right? So there's just a dovetailing that's kind of, yeah, it's really exciting to sort of see at this point.
It's so interesting as I've studied more and more about how Mason laid out from earliest years all the way through. When you see this big arch, you begin to see, okay, this is why this is happening at this time, and this is why they're ready for it now. And so it all goes together, and you get to see it more in these years. So that's an exciting thing as a teacher. See that in your students. It's exciting for the students as well.
Definitely.
All right, so I think the next subject will be English. Do you want to pick up and start there, Carrie? Carrie's going to talk to you a little bit about the first part of our English program. This is new for us. And so I'm going to tell you about this is in ninth grade. We've got this one.
Yeah.
And 10th grade too this year.
Yeah. And so part of this growing into the high school years is also where you're starting to see even more the blending of composition and grammar, right? So Kelly's going to go into a lot more of this in a minute, but in this essay voyage book, we've introduced Michael Clay Thompson's work earlier in grade 4, and it continues now all the way up. And this is much more than, okay, here's the format. Like this is not, it does teach how to write essays, but it's so much more than that. It is really looking at what makes good writing and why, and what are the undergirding ideas that we have to think through in order to create good writing, right? Like it's not just about, okay, what goes here and here and here, how do you put sentences together, but really what's happening? How do we become good communicators? How do we become good thinkers that then actually figure out, okay, I want my reader to understand what it is I'm talking about, and what are some ways that good writers have done that I can then learn and practice as a new writer, as a growing writer, right? As a writer that has been working on these things all the way along. So this is the next natural piece in this development as a writer. So we're really excited about just seeing how that brings, really, it becomes a topic that people are scared of, and it sounds, right, sort of like, oh no, I'm having to, how am I gonna be able to come up with something to say? It takes all that away, because he just has Mason talks about a passionate expert in a field writing about a topic. That's part of what a living book is. Well, Michael Clay Thompson is passionate about writing, and it just exudes on every page. I mean, he is so wanting this book's great for anyone to be able to grapple with these ideas and see them played out in writing, and then also start to really become a part of who you are as a writer. So we're looking forward to students working through these.
Yeah, and one of the things I really like about it is it's not that format. It's not stilted. It's based on ideas, and the ideas are what comes out. And it kind of comes along. Your students have been writing all along as they begin their written narrations, and there some directed narrations and things. And as they move forward into high school, they're doing a lot more writing, and this just comes alongside and makes that richer for them, and gives them some things to practice and to learn to bring their voice forward. So that's a really good ad. We're excited about that. Throughout the composition in the lesson plans, you'll see there are composition lessons that outside of this that incorporate all of the subjects all along the way, and it's kind of progressive as you go as to what you're doing, and it depends upon the year. For example, when you're doing a lot of source documents, you're finding a lot of the propositions, and then you begin to make your own propositions and learn how to support them. So you find them and you learn how to do them. And learning through some of those things happens in composition across those subjects all along. And it just progresses each year. As a student matures more and learns more and applies more, it becomes greater. And so as they move into 10th grade, I wanted to show you the next ones. So they're still doing Essay Voyage in 10th grade. They're doing some compositions and working through some more of that and practicing. And they're using the things that they're reading already to practice. And then we also bring in, there's something called the nature of poetry that we add in, and it really takes little lessons and talks through some of the styles of writing, not just poetry, but how things sound. And that goes through actually for 3 years, I believe, all the way through, so that you're doing a little bit at a time and you're learning more about those things and dovetailing with other writings that you're doing. You've got elements of style that it brings in, well, actually, let's go. This one is actually in grade 10 too. So this just brings up words. So it's like a fun dictionary of words that Bill Bryson tells you these are difficult ones, but they're ones that they actually run across. Why are you using these words and how do you use them? And the students use this as kind of a way to think about those things as they're reading through their other books. In grade 11, then we bring in the elements of style as one of the things that they work through a little bit of time, because it helps them to understand, okay, there are rules to things. And we see them in writing, we see the samples, and we find the samples in the writing of it. Oh, where is it that you use this and how does it work? And why is it important to use these words? Because words mean things and they're really important, and how we use them. Also in grade 11, I love this book. It's called Steering the Craft. And it is a book that takes you through, it's Ursula Le Guin. You might know her from some science fiction writing and some other essays that you may have read. But it takes them through lessons about style that really kind of incorporate some of the grammar that they've been practicing and learning. Talks about sentence complex and the syntax that they're using in those things. How do they use conjunctions and conjunctive phrases, and going through all of those things that they're learning, and gives them lessons to practice. So it talks about learning to write beautifully and learning how to also condense, because students have a hard time learning to do that sometimes. So it takes them through several different lessons. This is one that they'll use all year. It takes them slowly through as they practice writing through these things. So they go back and write gorgeously and practice how to take their person and change it into another way of their writing. So it incorporates some creative writing as well, but it gives them examples and ways to practice that. So it's a really good, solid writing and composition piece that they're using in 11th grade.
Kelly, this is another place too, right? To show that, again, Mason had books in the upper forms that were directly about writing and about words and about how to use words. But those words are not necessarily the words a lot of times, most of the time, that we're using today, right? So again, the need to kind of show, all right, we've got books that are now more in line like that, right? The Bryson book is a great example where she used a book that was, the words, we just don't use those words as much in the 21st century. And so there's a bringing forward once again of here's some resources that are relatable because they are talking about where we are in our time and place now. So it's really glad to be able to find books like this in print that we can use that are bringing those same ideas, the same way that Mason was using them, forward into our time and place.
Yeah. And so here's another one that does that. It's Caring for Words in a Culture of Lies. This is a grade 12 book that they go through, and it talks about how important it is that you're using words, and it talks about in our culture today. It brings it into a modern context for them, and it helps them to say, okay, what do I do about stories, sharing stories, and why is that important? And practicing and translating and working through not only your writing, but how you communicate with others. And so that's a really important one that's used in grade 12. Another one that kind of follows along, first you write a sentences when it's assigned, it kind of follows along right after this, the steering the craft, right? It tells them about, they practice and they learn the next phase as they're reading more through this, and it gives them things like learning how to understand, okay, so verbs, everybody loves nouns, and writers sometimes use these wonderful nouns like, like she mentions here, long abstract nouns like serendipity, or long adjectives like effervescent. And they're great words, but it makes the big words always disappoint because of all the things that are around them never getting the attention, and it takes away all the tension. So how do you add verbs to make that work in your writing? So, I mean, it's really actually really practical. And so little chunks that they go through, and they're able to go through and see, okay, as I'm writing, and begin applying it for themselves as they go along. So they may have a few lessons to say, okay, make sure you're doing this in your composition. But remember, they're in grade 12 now, and they're beginning to do that for themselves a lot more often without a lesson plan. It's becoming part of their voice and part of their writing style as they move forward. And so progression is really important. You don't start out here, but you're moving from here and going on, perhaps into more writing, depending upon what they choose to do moving forward. And it's a really important piece of how that progression works. So the last thing to tell you about for composition for grade 12 is we do a study specifically on the craft of research. Now this book is a pretty hefty book, but it's very clearly laid out, and the lessons are very clearly put forward, and it shows you about what is important about the research part of writing, how to apply what you're learning in ways that you can do academic writing, but only that helps to prove out not just my opinion, but where is it that people are showing, where's it the research can come forward to prove out your point. It even talks about, writing a master's thesis and how that plays into it all along. And it talks about things everywhere from plagiarism and how to avoid it, and then asking the right questions to understand your audience as you're writing, and integrating all your research and how to do that. So that takes them into a new level of writing that they haven't done before, but they will continue to do as they move through university if they go. So that kind of helps prepare them for the next step. So wow, that's a whole lot that's encompassed within the lesson plans, and it's already integrated in there. So it's not something that your student is juggling. It's all part of the whole. It's back to that whole big picture of how does it work in a program. Yeah,
that's great.
Okay,
move into literature.
Oh yeah, that's good. Let's do it. All right. Moving into literature. So, okay, I've got all these books over here. I got to shift over to the other side. So, as we start talking about literature, we have some books that we use all the time as we go through with the Oxford Book of American Verse and the Oxford Book of English Verse. We use both of those depending upon who we're studying each term, so that you can pull a lot of different poets out of that. And so I think those are even online, so you don't have to buy all those, but we use that. We integrate historic poems and ballads depending upon when it is, especially when there's nationalistic things happening and patriotism going on in different countries even, right? There's ballads that are being sung about great and wonderful things. We include those. We also do some very specific things depending upon who we're studying at the time, because it goes chronologically, right? So we have things like the Civil War poetry during the second term. We have a focus on Dunbar in the last term, who is a poet that's really important to the time frame. And so we're pulling all of those things in for poetry, but we do use a spine as well for American literature. Carrie, did you have the new one? This is my old copy.
Thank you.
It's American Literature by William Long. And this year, especially, there's a lot more literature that we're reading that's kind of focused on American national writers. But this is a really good book that outlines what's going on in writing and literature in America. And it's one of those books that you would be able to read aloud together and discuss as a class, talk about the ideas that are in here so that you're seeing how it's moving through. But it also then talks about specific authors. And so we talk about these authors because we read these authors. They're not pulled out and just reading about different people. We're reading about the people we're reading from. And so we read classics, like the American classics we would read are like Poe and Alcott and Twain, Hawthorne, Cather. So we have all of these books, depending upon what grade you're in, assigned at different times. So as we move chronologically, these authors will show up and you'll begin reading these. There's some short stories and other things that are included in the lesson plans that aren't part of a book that you purchase, but it's all together. We also have world history. So we're bringing in other areas and other voices. And so we have Dickens. Oh, actually, I probably should do that first already. The Dickens and the Robert Louis Stevenson and George Eliot and Dostoevsky and Bronte. So we're bringing in world history or world literature as well, because it goes with the historical time frame, either because they wrote then or they write about it. But most of these are authors that were written at the time. And so we're following the American authors through American literature, but we include other resources in the program so that you also know about some of the other writers that were writing. There's a couple of really new ones that we're really excited about. I'm going to tell you about this section. So as part of our world history, we've got different grades are reading Frankenstein or Jane Eyre. And these are new from Karen Swallow Pryor. And it includes the text of the book, but we're really excited about them because they have in each section, she's broken them down in volumes. And at the end of each section, it has some reflection questions, right? And these are really good. Most of them are really good reflection questions that are kind of open-ended that help, depending on the age, the student to reflect and think about how this story is impacting the world around them and themselves. How does it work? So, for example, they'll show up in composition lessons. So, for example, how does Jane show truth and justice to be of great importance to her? And you're going to write an essay about that. And you're going to use the readings to support, okay, well, show me why you think that from the book. You have to include your source and cite that. So those things show up in composition as well, just how it overlaps. Mm-hmm. So these books are just a real exciting fun. I'm very excited about having these as part of our program and being able to use them because it's a guide for reading and reflecting. Then we also have a couple of other books that I'm gonna let Carrie tell you about these. It brings in other voices, and it's really important, I think, for us to do this as part of world history or American history. And so one of the books in Form 4 is called The Lightning Dreamer. It's in Term 1. Carrie, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so this is kind of that beautiful combination of literature, right? We're talking about literature, but it also connects to history. So an exciting kind of piece of that is looking at, this is a story about a Cuban abolitionist. So it's giving us the background of something that's happening at the same time, what's going on in the US history, but through looking at how the literature here and the history are going together, but similar themes, similar ideas, but coming from a different perspective, a different voice, a different way of thinking about it, because people's experiences in different places and are coming from different perspectives. It brings that whole conversation to light, right? We learn new things, we see new things, we understand new things by walking in other people's shoes and understanding what their experiences were. So it just broadens our understanding. And again, we're seeing where literature and history they're dovetailing together in so many different ways. So we're really excited about yeah, just bringing that voice into it and being able to think through it from a different perspective.
Well, not only that, Carrie, but one of the books that we also are using, it's a new book that's out. It's called The Bondwoman's Narrative. And Carrie's going to tell you about that one as well. It's something that takes the same idea for American history. And
yeah, so this is a grade 12 book. It is, I'll read a little bit here. It's a fascinating book. I've really just been, so excited about our students to read this. It starts off at the very beginning, just talking about how back on February 15th, that the editor of this book, Henry Louis Gates Jr., he bought a manuscript that he believes to be the first novel written by a fugitive slave. The Bondswoman narrative was written by someone who called herself Hannah Crafts and is patterned after Gothic and sentimental novels, especially Charles Dickens' Bleak House, Walter Scott's Rob Roy, and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, as well as African-American slave narratives, such as those of Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown. So, I mean, what an amazing find. I mean, to be able to read the actual manuscript. So he published it as a manuscript. So you sometimes see some things that are crossed out or words that are added that where she was writing, she was doing the craft of writing this novel. And you see some of the things that where she fixed her sentences or where she wanted to bring out different things. So you kind of get that perspective, as well as just she's telling, it's biographical, right? You're getting what actually happened and what she was wanting to communicate through her life story. So very hard reading in that way, a very difficult experience, but coming from her own perspective and her own voice in that sense, which is, just, it's priceless. So very excited. It also brings out even how the book was found and how they did the work to determine if it was authentic and things like that. Like, how did they know? So it adds all those different components to it, it's just really excited about students being able to read that one.
Yeah, that was good. Good find. All right. Okay. All right. So I guess it's time to talk about history. And being able to go through our American history, our world history, cultural history, source documents, and ancient history. We're going to talk about all those, and we're going to kind of go through just what the grade levels do, so you can see some of the progression and what they use together and what they don't. So we have, as Mason did, a history spine, right, for U.S. history. This is a really good, newer history book text that goes and covers through a lot of things, and it's very readable. It's approachable. It is not too weighed down in details, but it gives a lot of the outline and the overview. So and it's a good book. We use it through all the different rotations. So in combination with a spine book, of course, we add all the other things, and so they may be biographies. It may be a source document. It could be essays. It depending upon the term and the rotation. That's how it goes in. So just to show you the grade 9, we start out with Sexuea. This is a really readable narrative that brings in a lot of her information and the story about it that's based on source documents too. So it's really readable. This is what we start out with term 1. Then as we move through with U.S. history, we go to Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And this amazing friendship, Carrie's got it here, it's amazing friendship, brings forward conflict and resolution and friendship that develops and grows, and how that impacts the history of the time and what's going on then and the decisions that are made. And that relationship is a really important piece of this time frame. And so we've got that for the grade 9.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there for that one too. It also is really good at just bringing in his life's, you get the biography of Frederick Douglass in there, right? It's not just the it gives his story and then ties that into the relationship. So I was really glad to kind of see that it's focusing on who he was and the amazing his story, and then how that intersects, right? So it's bringing that together. It's also a really good one to say that, you know, not only are we looking for great books to use, but we also weigh reading level difficulty in relation to the whole curriculum together, right? So like this book might, if you were to look at it by yourself or just by itself and just say, oh, you know, this is a book that we're using in 9th grade, someone would be like, well, that's, you know, my 6th grader could read this book. Why are you using a book that looks like a 6th grader could read it in 9th grade? Well, it gives you a little bit of that picture of it's well written, has great illustrations and pictures as well, but it's also is a little bit of an easier read on purpose, because when you put all of the books together, as Kelly's going to talk through so there's not only the progression of 9 through 12, but there's also a progression, just even, or maybe it's better to say it's the compilation or the curriculum for a grade together, right? We're also looking at, is there a mixture of a little bit harder, a little bit easier, right? We put that together on purpose so that students are encouraged, right? We don't want them to be all like, oh, all these books are really difficult and a big step up. It's a gradual progression of growing in their reading abilities and their ability to think through ideas. And sometimes that's reflected in a little bit easier book. Sometimes it's reflected in a different type of book. So depending on that rotation again, and depending on what's being covered in the ideas, we do have books in there that are a little bit easier, a little bit harder. We want them to be stretched, but we also want them to enjoy and just relax and kind of delve into the topic as well.
Right, and connect with that. And all of those books, regardless of their difficulty level, the ideas that are in these books and the way they're presented is a really important piece that you know your students are going to get, and being able to develop a relationship with those ideas is going to come out with those books as well.
Exactly.
So here's an example of, so the President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul. It's Brian Kilmeade. It's a newer book that's out. It's a really good one, but it's at a little bit higher level. And so being able to use that one in grade 9 and this one in grade 10 is the way that way it'll balance out a little bit more, but you're getting the ideas. And you can see how it, maybe even the content might be a little bit harder and higher in this one. So that's the way that kind of works together. The other, so in the third term, as we move forward chronologically, we're going to talk about a book. Now this one is a little bit more, it's great for using it's pictures, it's photographs, right? This is, they photographed, this is what's coming into play at this time, right? And so the photographs of what's happening at the World's Fair in Chicago it's a whole photographic record. And so you're able to go through and see what the things were like. And so as you're looking through that, you're saying, this is what's been happening at this time frame. And I really kind of like it because there's another book that's used that we'll talk about in a minute that kind of overlaps and connects with those things. And then we also have some biographies of what we would consider robber barons. And it talks about who these people are, right? Who is Rockefeller and Morgan and Carnegie and Vanderbilt, and how do they impact the culture and the world at this time, and what were they doing that impacted society. And so those are part of the history rotation for that. If we move forward into the next grade level, then you're getting maybe even some different subjects as you move along. And so for the US history, we're all using that spine book, but then these are used in grade 10, The Adventures of the Mountain Men, and they are stories that are true stories about the West and what was happening at the beginning of the exploration and how it changed moving forward a little bit. This was really interesting because it helped me when I was reading through them to kind of look and see, okay, how does that overlap and influence literature of the time of American literature, and your students will be able to see how that impacts it and works together. This was a really interesting reading in the short bits. So it's not a huge long story, but there's a bunch of different ones, and they'll be from different authors, and so you'll probably recognize some of them as you go along as well. And then of course we mentioned the freedom fighter, and then the last one it's called I Am Man, and it's Chief Standing Bear's journey to justice, and we've talked a lot about the indigenous peoples earlier on in our rotation, and we move forward and see what's happening. They didn't fall away. As a matter of fact, during this time in history, there's a lot going on with that in the Indian removal, and you're going to see that in the next level in grade 11 with Pushing the Bear. Carrie's going to tell you about that. This is the beginning, and it talks about when it's starting to happen, and this is what this one man has done about it in term 3. So we've got this in term 1 for a different grade, but we're covering it from all different angles, and we're seeing this was an amazing man who went through the legal processes and through the court systems to get protection and recognition and freedom for his people. So it's a true story as well. So then as we move into grade 11, this is what's going on in grade 11. Carrie, can you tell about Pushing the Bear?
Yeah, so again, we're looking for how do we bring these other voices in? We know that a one-dimensional or a one way of hearing the history recounted doesn't give us the full rounded picture of what was going on, what was actually happening. So this is an amazing example of that, where this book is told from the perspective of the Cherokee people, right? Like what was happening? How did they perceive that whole situation of being removed? It starts in North Carolina, and you walk with them as they're going. It's a fascinating kind of way to do it too, because there's multiple characters, and the reading is divided up by their particular voices, and it comes back around and you hear about them again and rotate through. And it's hard. It's a very hard story. It's appropriately hard for what happened. So, this is a book where, as we're getting to the upper years of the grades, right, 9, 11, and 12, they're dealing with harder material. We want them to engage with, okay, this is the world that we live in, and these are it's told appropriately, but it is not it's not trying to cover over or any way minimize what happened. So this would be a really great one to pre-read as a teacher, so that you can interact well with your students on these topics and be able to help them navigate through there's a lot of questions that are raised, right? Like, why did this happen? And how did this occur? And how do we understand this? So
how do we understand justice?
Exactly.
That
right.
changes.
Right.
And realizing, okay, so this is the Cherokee, this is the Ponca,
Yep.
and beginning to recognize that there's not one trail of tears. It's something that when you're looking at a traditional education and you're compartmentalizing things, you have to realize, it's not one tribe, right? We're not one indigenous people group. We've got a lot of things going on, and it's an important way to recognize, it's not one event. It's about a whole century of justice and injustice, and how do we deal with that, and how do we see that from different viewpoints? This is also both of these. This one's also from this one. It's also from the point of view of Chief Standing Bear and Paulson. So it's whenever we can hear things and the people's voice that it happened to, it makes a bigger impact. It helps us see their humanity and see what's happened, and it gives us that other perspective that we need to see. We need to see beyond the one perspective and see a rounded view of many of those things. So here's the last one that grade 11 uses, and it begins to take us further in, and we're talking a little bit during this time frame about the gold rush, and that, so we talked about the westward movement and what's happening. What brought a lot of people that direction is, of course, the California gold rush, and some other things, that the Continental Railroad and the building of all those things. And some of those things are going to move into the next rotation, but this is a personal story from a life of a woman in a mining camp. And so she has a different voice to give us, as well as her experience would be very different from some of the other ones that we would read. But it's a really interesting account that students can read through and be able to kind of live in that time frame and live in that place with her. It's a good narrative that brings you into relationship with it and into like you're there. So the final one for American history is grade 12. This is another book that does that. It brings you there and it takes you through. And this this book is just amazing. I am so glad. It goes all 3 terms. It's a rather long book, but it's very readable. It is taking you all the way from just the beginning of the Western movement and all the things that encompass that. So it takes you north and with Lewis and Clark, and it takes you across those different nations, tribal nations, and their interactions with people. It takes you through with the explorers and trappers. It moves you through with the people that were moving from the colonies all the way through, and then change from colonies to being the states, and moving through and all their process of doing that and why they did that, the motivations for that. Takes you down into the and begins to show you Mexico and what was happening, because California wasn't always California and Texas wasn't always Texas, and how those things come into play during this time frame. The Mexican-American War and how Texas becomes a state. All of that's encompassed in here. Wow. It's all tied together. So you see this flow of a story. So I'm really excited about this one, as you can tell. It's a really good story about the history of the American West, and it brings in a lot. It's not isolated to a Western town or a small Western. It's a big, broad scope of Western expansion and what's going on and how it impacts the whole United States. So that's a great one. Okay, so that's all of American history. And we're showing you a lot of the different books because remember, we're going through all the way through from grade 9 through grade 12, and how those different things, depending upon your grade level, are more appropriate for one or another, and what they might do. All these grades are going to have such great books. I'm very excited about it. I get excited about it.
It's a good point too, Kelly, to sort of say, this is where that freedom as the teacher to go, right, you're seeing kind of the progression across the grades, but you can see the beauty of the fact that the whole school is following the same rotation, right, allows you to then sort of look through that and go, okay, well, what books here, what level it best fits my student, right? So that there might be books in that we just described that you say, okay, yeah, that's really where my student fits. So because you would have access then to the lesson plans, you could choose a book that might be slotted for 10th grade, even 9th grade, right? You use it with an older student as well, because this is that freedom that you have to make these programs really fit your context. What's your setting? What's going on?
Yeah. And where you are and what your students are really interested in. And it's not interest driven so much as it covers all of that. So you're able to say, okay, studies do serve for delight, and your kids are going to learn so much, and your students are going to enjoy working together in some of these areas. And just the discussions are going to be amazing. I love history.
Yep.
All right, so let's go into world history and talk a little bit through that. So also through the different forms or different grade levels, we we're covering a lot of the same things, but it's going to be at different content levels and different maturity levels. One of the things I really like about grade 9 is we use this throughout several rotations, and there are stories, true stories about map making. There's map makers and there's stories. And so if you're looking at mapping North America and pulling that in, and as they're reading all these other things, they're looking at how this happened, and it just kind of it gives it an overall context as well. So I really like that, the way that book does that with maps. It also has world maps as well. It's not just North America. That happens to be where we hit in that one, but there are also different world maps and where that's happening around the world, Asia, and different things are going to pull in from that. Now, another book that is used, that it was used in the rotation last year and the year before. It is an adaptation for young people. So it's 1493, and it says From Columbus's Voyage to Globalization. Focus on the word globalization. This is world history. It's not just about Columbus discovering something and all about America. This is world history. It takes you all around what's happening in the world at different times. So this is the younger version. The forms 5 and 6, or grades 10, 11, and 12, use the older version. And depending upon where they are in the lesson plans, it'll tell you it's going to be divided up. The chapters are even divided up to the appropriate chronology. So that may not come in until term 2 or 3, or this one starts in term 1 and overlaps. So those come into play for world history at the different appropriate times. There's another book that is used called The Silk Roads. Form 4 has a book that's a younger version of this as well. It's a much easier version. It's a beautiful book. It's a much easier version, and there is a chapter that is included because we can use that for educational purposes, and we're not using the whole thing. It wouldn't be appropriate for that grade, but it does bring in something really important. It's fair use policy for us to be able to use that. So we'll add that for you. So you'll get that in grade 9 as well, to kind of give you part of that overview. But then forms 5, 6, and grades 10, 11, and 12 will also be reading this one. This is a little bit more difficult read. It has a lot in there. It's narrative and it's relatable, but the lesson plans take that into account and we'll break it out. So that's one of those other reasons why we kind of try to balance some different things out with that. In term 2, the things that are going on in the world, there's a lot going on in Europe, and there's a lot of change of power. There's a lot of battles. There's a lot of struggles. It impacts how all those nations change, and how the countries' borders change, and why. And the revolutions of that time frame are really important to be able to cover that. And so we cover it through a small book here that talks about each one. It's not a huge detail, but it helps you to see the relationships between those things. And the student will be able to say, okay, this is what's happening in the world, and this is what's happening in the US, and this is what's happening, how they all mix together, and see those points. So the last piece of that I want to point out is in grades 5 and 6, forms 5 and 6, grades 10, 11, and 12. As you can tell, I struggle with doing both of those now. If you're not familiar with forms, it's very confusing. So we want to make sure you understand the grades with it too, so and how those work. But this is a biography of Napoleon. Now, we studied a little bit about the French Revolution last rotation at the end. We're doing a little bit more. So we're reaching back a little bit because Napoleon's life impacts a lot of this stuff. And the things that are going on. And this is a great biography. It's called a concise biography because it is concise, but it's very interesting. It talks you through about who he is and how he became what we know of him, all the way through when he was Emperor of France, and his exile as well, and how that came and went sometimes. So it gives you a good understanding of how this European impact changes things, and with Napoleon's life, and that's a big important piece of history for that. So we're pulling all these important pieces together because it flows as you study along. All of these things are going to flow. That's why we use a spine. The Silk Roads and the 1493 are part of the spines that we use for the world history, and so they all fit together to give these pieces and see the bigger picture of what's going on in our world, because we're not alone, we're not isolated. We the things that happen in other places are important to us also, because they impact everything. And students, as they start growing older and getting more and more deeper relationships in these things, begin to see that. And so as teachers, we spread this before them so that they'll be able to use those ideas to begin gathering around the facts and the reality, but it's the ideas that are there that help them bring that into context. Okay, so that's world history. Then we have something that you might not be familiar with. It's called what we call cultural history. It was in Mason's programs. It's just put in under the different categories of world history or national history and how those work together. But it helps to show what's happening around an event, a person, or a particular era of something, right? So it takes that cultural title because as you're looking at it, you see what's happening around the individual. So like in grade 9, Diary of an Early American Boy is what we use for term 1, and it's focused on American, right? Early American. And it has wonderful sketches. If you're not familiar with Eric Sloan books, this is a Book of Centuries book too. It will bring forward a lot of the things that are happening. What is the daily life of an American boy in 1805, and what is it that he's seeing? What is he's doing? What are the tools he's using? How are they used in his daily life and his community? All of those things are brought forward in this book for term 1. Let's see, in term 2 for cultural history, the grade 9 is reading Barracoon. Carrie, do you want to tell us this one?
Yeah, that's again, we're looking for let's look at these voices from different perspectives. So this is going to tell the story of a man who came over on the slave ships and what that experience was like from his own words, and how his rest of his life, what happened after that. And you have to navigate through those difficulties, but it brings it to life that these were people. This is not just a aspect of history. These are people. And how does that affect that?
One of the things that's really a little different about this one is that it starts with his youth and his childhood in Africa. So it starts before he was a slave and before he was captured, and it's his life in Africa as a young child and what that looked like as well. So that's a piece of cultural history. So you're seeing that migration picture of what a person's life is at the beginning, what the struggles they go through, what's happening, and what happens at the end of life as well. So it's a whole picture of his life. So, and then let's see, this is where the Eiffel Tower for young people comes in. So you remember we were talking about the Chicago Fair and what's happening there. At the same time, they're beginning to build the Eiffel Tower for the World's Fair there. So it's kind of overlaps a little bit. And so it gives your student a perspective from Chicago and from Paris, and talks about all the things that are going on around that. It brings in a lot of the engineering and the people and the culture of Paris and the people that are there and what's going on, and who's interested, and all of those, all that picture brings in the culture for that. That
reinforces, it's kind of fun too, how that one reinforces then the book about the Statue of Liberty and what's happening and the whole Eiffel Tower, right? Like you get the Eiffel Tower is in the architecture book. So there's just, again, more crossovers of things that are coming together than, it's amazing how many ways these different books will reinforce each other as students are going through them.
Yeah. Yeah. And this next book for grades 10, 11, and 12, forms 5 and 6, they're both reading this the whole time, all 3 terms. It's also one of those that goes across a lot of time. It's called The Greater Journey. Dave McCullough. It's wonderful. If you haven't read some of he's a historian that does a lot of research that goes into his books. This is, I was just going to read the back to you a little bit. It says, as David McCullough writes, not all pioneers went west. In The Greater Journey, he tells the enthralling, inspiring, and until now untold story of the adventurous Americans, the artists, the writers, the doctors, the politicians, and others who set off for Paris in the years between 1830 and 1900, who were hungry to learn and to excel in their work. So what they achieved profoundly impacted American history. And so these Americans that went to Paris, which was a center for all these cultural aspects, whether that was medicine, that was a center for medicine. There was lots going on in the medical world there and in the practice and what they were finding. There was a lot going on in art and architecture. There's just politics, a lot of those things. Sumner went across and spent some time and was able to see the way that people interacted, and he became a very strong abolitionist because of the people that he interacted with. He was with not Americans. They were Black individuals that had come from other places and immigrated to Paris and were at the university there with him. And so being able to see how other cultures treated people differently and how all that interacts made a difference and an impact in his life. And he made a difference because of that too. So the relationships you get to see with the people that you'll be familiar with, a lot of them. And they will have studied these artists and looked at these musicians and different people. They'll have come up from before in their history, and you'll see them overlap all year long in who these people are and what they did and how that impacted us and still impacts us today. That's a great cultural history book. Source documents, or actually ancient history. Let's do ancient history, because ancient history is this year is very focused on source documents and artifacts. So you're going to be able to go through and see the Roman Republic and the change and the growth. So not everything's all about Julius Caesar, right? Julius Caesar starts at this turn, and you move forward from there. There's a lot of different changes in what's going on in Rome from there. And so we use the source documents, and it takes us all the way through the early Christian times. And so there's early Christian writings that are included in, I may have mentioned it with the biographies that the reading in church history in 5 and 6. Form 4 picks it up here a little bit because they get the biographies of early Christian women and in the early church. And so they're going to be reading about that as well.
That's grade 9, right? That's grade 9 that they're reading that? Yeah, that's great.
Grade 9. Mm-hmm. And so as you move forward, grade 10, 11, and 12 will also be doing early Christian writings alongside, back in Bible in church history, they're doing the biographies, but they're also doing writings. So they're going to read some of the source documents from some of those individuals as well. And some of those individuals were referred to some of these source documents that they're reading as well. So there is, that's for grade 10. Grade 11 and 12 use a spine book called Ancient Empires. It is, it's an actual textbook. It's a college text that I have a kind of a personal connection with Dr. Graham, who is a professor at Grove City College, who is a Grove City College professor. My daughter, one of my children who went through there, had him, and was inspired to do history herself as part of that. But he is one of the authors of this book, and so it is very difficult to study ancient history by picking and grabbing. It's a huge there's huge topics. It's all, and it ranges, right? So we don't just study Greece and one thing, or Rome. Rome wasn't about that one period, right? So we're looking all the way through those. This is ancient empires, and it takes a look at all the things that are happening within the rise and fall of empires, and it makes a statement. It kind of goes through as it takes the students through what's happening. It talks about how empires are built on ideology, economics, military, and politics. And so he's going to go through all that. And as a spine, that pulls all the things together that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do with one narrative book. But we do have a couple that are used. So this will be used all year long, and it continues to be used during the different rotations. And it is still quite readable. Tells the story from that perspective. And then we'll add in, only this year as optional for grades 11 and 12, maybe even grade 10, but they're optional. One is the Colosseum, and one is the Rubicon, right? So I think it's actually the Rubicon would be in term 1, Colosseum would be in term 2 or 3. Both of these are really good narratives, but you need to pre-read them as the teacher. There are some things, it's not graphic, but there are some things that you would want to know about ancient cultures that will be encountered. So you need to pre-read those if you want your student to read them. But you need to be very careful in ancient history about choosing books that are not on the program. Just because you find a book about Julius Caesar or the Colosseum or things that are happening does not mean that your students should take that book or your students should be reading them. There's a lot of different things in the culture of, and most of them are not written for students of, they're written for adults and have content in them that would be objectionable. So be very careful and pre-read these. These are on the program, so they're okay, but be careful with the other ones. Don't just pick them up. So we carefully plan out. We have a historian who goes through and plans out the lesson plans specifically for the age group and content. So that's, and then all the grades still keep a focus on the source documents and the artifacts as they go through. So
yeah, and that's really exciting piece too, right? Because again, we can see in the programs with Mason that those studying of the artifacts and of looking at, she was, very encouraging of going to museums and seeing those things for the students themselves, being able to see those things. And it's amazing. One of those gifts of technology now, right? Coming into the 21st century, where we have access to museum artifacts without leaving home. So, we can be in the classroom and we can watch and look and read about these various things that, you can go and see them, which is great and amazing. But we can also be able to go through these different artifacts and see how they portray the culture of the time, right? How they help us to see who these people were and similarities with us, difference with us, right? How they lived, things that were around them, the material culture. That's a huge component that, again, we're bringing forward what was Mason doing and looking at it as what can we utilize today to be able to do that same thing. We're not all close to the British Museum. We can't just go and take a look at those. Some students maybe, and that's amazing. That would be great. But we have museums around us, but we also have access on the internet to be able to see those things. So,
and there's so many more things. There's so many more things. As Carrie said earlier with archaeology and architecture, those things were just beginning to happen. Right. And on the cutting edge of those with we're finding those things, and there's been languages discovered and all kinds of cities and artifacts that weren't available to those students at their time that are available now. We can do that. It's a great way to bring in the ideas for discussion about culture and about what they're seeing about the art and the source documents and the reading. So we actually will be reading the Aeneid as poetry It's an epic poem that we're using it in poetry and in ancient history this year because it overlaps and goes through some of those things. And so all of these things together are really good ways to bring your students together and discuss them and see what they're thinking about them and be able to talk through some of those things. It's good for you to do.
That's great. Yeah, so then kind of continuing on into geography. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Missed those.
Let's do the source documents as well.
Yep.
Mason included those as well as the artifacts and things. That's kind of part of primary type sources. Mason also included source documents. They were reading the letters and the things that were the documents that were around that they could find. That was part of the program. And that's what we do as well. So we include the source documents. And now some of those may be biographies or autobiographies. Biographies would be secondary sources, autobiographies, primary sources. Things like the documents of, like last year we read the Constitution. There are speeches that were given. And all of those things would be primary source documents if we find them in history. And so we're utilizing those. The first thing we're going to do is listen to the American Spirit. And so David McCullough is, of course, the historian we mentioned earlier. He does a lot with American history, and he does a lot of speaking. And these are from, you can get the book, but we want you to get the audio because you can hear him. He's the one that's doing the readings. And these were, most of them were speeches given at universities or at special historical events. And so these are used each year following the chronological placement, just where they fall in. So you'll see those. We use this book. It's a great book. It's Letters of Americans to Their Children. It's called Posterity. And so these would be original primary source documents, right? Because they're the letters between the individuals that the students will be seeing in their books and know from history about what's going on. So they'll be reading the letters back and forth to their children and to different people. And the last thing that we'll be utilizing this year in source documents is Louisa May Alcott's hospital sketches. So before she even wrote a novel, before that was popular, she was a nurse at the Washington Hospital, and this really kind of chronicles the early impacts that women were making in war and how they were being part of the whole medical community and where that was happening. And it kind of balances kind of the horrors of what you see coming in and being treated by the real human people, those who were treating and those who were medically helping individuals and those who were hurt as well. And so it humanizes people as well, both the writer, and it's of course from her perspective, it's a source document. So this is a really good inclusion for our term 2 and gives us a perspective from a different view of Civil War. All right, now let's move into geography.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so geography as a whole, again, you see this sort of things pivot around history in a lot of ways, just like in Mason's curriculum. So here's the kind of geography has multiple facets. One is this historical geography piece. Another is more of the regional or like what's the actual land look like, right? Like what's happening across nations, across the world, what do different places look like, right? Sort of that same idea of we want to get a sense of what is the land like and what is it like to be there? And so getting a perspective from different places in the world. There's sometimes a geopolitical side to this. So how does the geography impact the political climate and what's happening? As well as cartography, right? So a whole study of maps. We've mentioned the map book in history, and we use maps in Bible. We use maps in even in literature sometimes, right? So there's all sorts of ways where the maps show up, but there's also in geography, obviously, there's a lot of mapping that goes on just so that we can have that. Mason talks about that mental picture, right? We're building our mental pictures and we're able to work on a map, and then as we work on it over the whole term, we're starting to internalize, yeah, when I see or hear something mentioned, a place maybe in current events, I've got a mental picture of that map where I can go, yeah, I know, I have a general idea of where this is happening in the world and what are the other players that are around there. So depending on the rotation, different books come as part of that whole blend of geography. So for this year, one new one that's really exciting just came out is called 5 Months on the Missouri River. So it's actually a gentleman who makes that canoe himself, along with a relative of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So it's kind of a neat connection with the actual time period, what happened. And it's full of amazing photos that just depict a lot of the things all along the way. So he is starting in Montana and he's going through, so it's going opposite direction. He's following in the footsteps of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but backwards. So he makes that point, but all the way along, he is showing, giving you pieces of the journals and their descriptions of the land and what they saw at the time. And then he's showing you via pictures and text what he's seeing. And what's the same? What are the exact same pieces of the geography that we can still see today? And what's different? Where has the river changed? And what's along the banks? And how is the geology exposed by the river? What can we learn about going through this? So it's not only telling us what the Lewis and Clark expedition was like, but it's also showing us what does this area of the country look like. And if you're not from this area, this is very different countryside. If you live in Florida, or you live in Alaska or anywhere else, it's going to give you that piece of, oh, this is what this area, the middle of the country looks like. And this is what it looks like from a river. Like that's not our typical way of seeing things. We don't do a lot of river travel nowadays, but during this time period that we're studying, this was a very common way of seeing the world and seeing the countryside. So it kind of reinforces multiple pieces of the history, of the literature, of what's happening, as well as the science. You get some sort of the nature study. He points out he's a botanist, so you get some of the flora and the fauna and the animals and all the different creatures that they run across. So yeah, a fascinating sort of leisurely pace down the river, 5 months. You're going to be living with them as they go down there. So this is for all the grades. And then as well, they have like 9th grade. This is one that's in the curriculum every year for 9th grade, is A Prisoners of Geography. This is by Tim Marshall. This is a fascinating book at looking at 10 maps around the world and how does their geography, that specific region of the world, how has that impacted the history and the political scene, what's going on, what are the conflicts, how has a region developed, what's happening, and how does the geography help us to understand why these things have happened. You have a mountain range right in the middle. Well, these two people on both sides, they're not necessarily, certainly through a lot of history, they are not interacting. They're developing independently, right? So you've got whole ways to sort of take in not only history, but the current events, what's happening currently and why. Well, geography plays a huge role in that. So that's a book that is every 9th grader has. Then we do map work along with that. So we're continuing these map drill idea, but it's broadening a bit, right? Now we're working on, okay, let's read something about that, add to your own map, create a map of the region, add the things that interest you, do some research to kind of add new things, right? You're working on it every week. You're doing a memory map again, where you're trying to recall what did you add last time that you read it last week, adding new things, trying to recall it again. So slowly you're building up this mental picture of that whole area of the world, so that, again, you're reading a book, you're listening to current events, something's happening, and you can immediately pull that piece up of, oh, I have a rough outline of where this is taking place, and not only the political outline of the countries, but the geography. Like where are those mountains, and where is their water, and where are their rivers, and how is that playing into it? So fascinating book for sure. Then we also see that this other piece. So while that's the ninth grade book, as they go through 10 and 11 and 12, there's a couple books that are used each rotation. So there's a term of cartography in those grades that are out of this book called All Over the Map. So if you were to flip through it, you'd see these are maps that are literally all over. They are all different types of maps. They're all different, from different ways of drawing maps, different perspectives. It's a fascinating look at how maps help us to see the world. There's things from the ocean floor to the stars, to the mountains, to under the ground, to in cities. I mean, it's even one of the most fascinating ones that I like is how the sunk boats in a harbor, they've actually been able to see where the land was and how those buried boats, like what happened to them and how they ended up just building on top of them. So the map depicts that, and it tells you about it. So the text kind of gives you the history or how it came about or what the map's about, and then you get to look at it. So the students in this case aren't reading this as a narrative to go through, but they're reading a small bit of it, a few maps every week, and they're gaining ideas so that the lesson plans have them more, well, what questions do these maps raise, right? You're writing out some questions. It's a spurring you on to, well, that's interesting. How could I make a map like this? Like this has something to do with London and during the war. Okay, well, I'm reading about the Civil War. Well, how could I make a map that would be similar in my history books? So it's giving them ideas, as well as just the ideas of the maps themselves are amazing. So this is one of those books that has all sorts of different reasons to be reading it, and fascinating interest across the board. At the same time,
it's so idea based. I like that it's so idea based, and it is that spark that generates. Oh, exactly. How does it apply to other things?
Yep. And then building on what was happening in grades 7 and 8, when they're learning about the states, they read across the grades again. We read a little bit each year, so they're not reading all of this at one time. But this is an older regional approach, very narrative. It's a regional geography of the United States and Canada. So they're getting a perspective of what does this going across, what does it look like? And who are these people? And just short sections, not a lot on each area. Obviously, you can't cover the Canada and the US as, in long sections on each piece, but small sections that are telling them, okay, what's happening in the Central Plains, and what were the prairie wheatlands, and who are these people that settled, and where did they come from, and what were they doing, and why is so much wheat being grown here? Like, what's going on, right? So it's just looking at the people themselves and who they are, and then what are they doing, and why is this region unique compared to other regions, and what's going on. So it gives you this, we've got this broadening relationship, right? You're starting, as you're little, you're learning about your home and your town or your village or where you live, and it's moving out, your state, and now we're talking about regions, and then now we're getting this broader perspective of here's Canada and the US all together as regions, and so you're developing this relationship with your world around you. So that's how that fits in, and that's why it goes across, and each grade is reading a little piece of that. And then another one for this time period, now this is more of the historical geography piece, is called Sufferings in Africa. And it is a astonishing account, truly is, of a New England sea captain who's enslaved by North African Arabs. So now we've jumped to a whole another region of the world, but it's a firsthand account of somebody's experience, right? The sea captain that was foundered on the coast, and what happened to him and his journey all through the North African region. So you get a picture of not only the times and what's happening in the world during our time period, but you get a picture of what did it look like? What was it like to be traveling around that region? And who are these people and what are they doing and how do they live? And the fascinating connection as well with US history is this was a book that Abraham Lincoln read as a young man and had implications for the rest of his life. So we're reading it as well and seeing how that tied into what happens throughout this time period. So again, it has some hard parts to it, but these are first person accounts of what life was like. So we're getting that picture there. And then in 12th grade, kind of this was the 9th grade one, looking at prisoners of geography. There's a 12th grade book that he just came out called The Power of Geography. So same author, new maps, 10 new regions of the world, that he's now looking a bit forward, like trying to even say, okay, how does geography help us understand what could happen and where are things that are difficult or the tensions in the world, and how does geography play a role into that? So again, kind of that current events look at how do these things, how does history, all these things intersect, and how does it help us to have a broader perspective? Again, we're looking at it as good citizens, right? This history, we've got current events, we've got source documents all coming together. We're adding geography into this so that we have good perspectives, right? Making decisions, being wise. What does this look like? And how do we bring these things to bear, looking forward into the future? So another book by Tim Marshall. So that's a good overview of geography for you. Then looking at, you'll notice on the program that there's Latin continues. We have life skills, various things go from term to term. And in the high school, when they're appropriate things from the lower grades where they have additional projects that would be at the right developmental level, we carry that on. So in a school setting, you can utilize the same thing all the way through the grades. Same thing at home, right? If you've got younger kids, they can be working together with older kids. That's a great way for the different grades to work together. So some of these things work well for that, as well as we through the rotations, we'll also add life skill things that are just more pertinent to high schoolers too. So you'll see that changes through the rotations depending on what's being used. But again, there's lesson plans there for all those. Modern languages continue. You can look through and see that's just building on what was done in prior grades. Physical education, the same way. Schools and homes can utilize that. Again, older students with younger students. There's historical dances. That's all included in there. Games and sports, different things. Exercise, some rotations. We add stretching and different components to that piece, just so that we're again thinking of it in terms of, we want your students to have life habits, right? Life habits that enable them to, if you have a desk job or you have an active job, what does it look like to be able to be well fit, right? So that you can do your jobs well and enjoy what you're doing. And then looking at music, same thing. We've got this progression throughout the grades, it goes up. There's questions within those same lesson plans that would apply to the older students, how to think about what you're listening to, ask different questions, broadening that relationship once again, so that they're learning different things, they're applying what they've learned before to now new pieces, new composers, new, again, that fits the time period. So understanding just broadens out. Sometimes we add biographies in there, sometimes we don't. This time there's we just follow the lesson plans for the music, and there's lots of different activities to do to make that really come alive.
I like the way that that many of those can be done in large group settings or small group settings, either one, and it's always based on the skills that you've already acquired and moving forward. So that progression just shows in skill level as well.
Yeah, that's right. And then that leads us to our last subjects here of math and science. One thing that we're always looking for, or just trying to, again, we're always thinking through these relationship, the growth of a relationship lens. So students have been out in nature, doing nature study all these years growing up. So we're always looking for, but it continues. So we're looking for ways to, how do we bring a new dimension to that relationship? So one of the ways, this is a new book that's in the programs this year. It's called Earth Almanac. And just like Mason talked about with this book of first ideas, you may have heard mention that before, where we're part of nature study is noticing the first time you might see a certain flower bloom, or the first time a bird is back if it's not in your area through the winter. When's the first time that we see it? Or the first time that it snows, right? All sorts of firsts. And there's an actual study that, it's called phrenology, on the seasonal rhythmic patterns of nature. And based on your particular region and area, like it's always different depending on where you live. So this book sort of brings that idea to life a little bit more. So if you've heard of this, but your students heard of it, but you don't quite know exactly what to do with that, well, this is just a around the world kind of look at through the seasons, as a daily entry, follows the calendar, but it might be caribou lichen buffet, talking about reindeer lichen. It might be talking about the inland sea, or horny toads, or darters, or, it's a wide variety of stuff. No region is going to be kind of left out. Like if you live by the sea and you think, well, all the nature study is pertaining to the mountains, this isn't the case. It touches from the sea to the mountains to deserts, everywhere in between. There's a little bit of everything. But it's just helping kind of helping our students observe and notice, what are these rhythmic patterns of nature, and what is that seasonal variation in your region, like where you live, right? What does it? Some there's not much variation, right? If you're in the tropic zones, right, there might be not a lot of variation, but there's still some sort of rhythm that happens. And so paying attention to that, this kind of just brings that out. So this isn't required reading. We just always give a little list of ways that you can add to your toolbox of things to pay attention to, and to grow your observation skills, grow your nature study skills. So this is just an addition to that list. There's one that's been on there last year as well, called Nature Obscura. And this is looking at a city's hidden natural world, right? Some people aren't near a park or someplace that has a bunch of it's no meadows are around. Well, there's still a hidden world of nature that's not necessarily so hidden in cities, right? So if that's your setting, this book might be really helpful to help you to start observing more of what's right around you that we sometimes might not see. There's another one on that list called The Lost Art of Reading Nature's Signs. This one is amazing, just for really helping us observe, all these things that are right under our nose that we wouldn't ever really pay attention to until someone helps us see them. And then all of a sudden we can't stop seeing them, right? It's all comes to life, and now we see them all over the place, and we hadn't ever seen them before. So this book really does that in a lot of ways, just looking at weather, predicting weather, locating water, tracking animals, a whole bunch of forgotten skills that, it's just amazing to read. Like, how did people recognize these things or see these things? Well, they had skills and tools that they knew how to read different things, and we've lost some of that. And so this book kind of is working on bringing that back. So again, these are not required readings. These are just optional readings, because at this point, right, we're hoping that your students are growing in their love of the natural world. And so they're looking for ways to expand that. So we want to be sure to kind of give different resources that might be, fit what they're looking for, how to help them to just grow in that and add to their nature notebooks and be inspired all over again sometimes, right? Sometimes we can lose a little bit of that inspiration, and we just need something to kind of help us to start seeing again. So that might be a good place to look if you're new to nature study as a high school student teacher, right? If you're a teacher and this is new, you haven't incorporated these things into the classroom, these books might be a good way to introduce that at the high school level. All right, then looking at what's happening now in math and science, they start to, because now this growth in relationship for science is now expanding, right? And we're beginning the disciplinary studies of physics, biology, and chemistry, which is the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade studies. There's this growing, tying back into citizenship again. What do we need to know now as people living in the 21st century in these different areas? Because these areas are frequently in the news in multiple different ways. They are playing into our current events of our time. And so what's the kind of, how do we introduce our students and broaden their understanding of these subjects? And also, how do we prepare them well? Some of these students might go into the science fields, right? So we want to have, Mason talks about the doors of a home being kind of these, where we walk through doors to be, and then go into different rooms that are these different relationships with different things. And we don't want any doors to be shut off, right? We don't want, because of our, how we help them expand in that funnel, we don't want doors to be closed to our students, because we want them to continue to grow in all these areas. So hence why we do more of a disciplinary type studying as science as a discipline, and how that now is being wedded with math, because math being, it's kind of the language of the universe. So how do these things come together? So that's what the science books, there's a series by John Mays for 9th grade. This is the introductory physics. Now, some of you, that might be really scary sounding, because you think of physics as like a 12th grade physics class that was really hard or didn't make a lot of sense to you. There's, you might have had a bad science experience in your own high school. So sometimes that kind of raises, wait, how can we be doing this in 9th grade? There's no way my student could do that. But this is introductory physics. So this is assuming that your student is taking algebra concurrently, or in our case, if you've been following along through the progression, you've done half of your algebra book in 8th grade, and you're doing the second half in 9th grade, along with starting geometry. That would be, this is the appropriate level of physics for that. So there is no assumption that students have finished algebra or even have mostly the way through. It's starting with that being a concurrent study. So no worries there if that's where your student is. If your student isn't quite ready for algebra, there's also in our programs, we've got some options there for what to do in science if that's not the case while they're waiting to get to algebra, and you can start this. But so because this is a single author, again, we get that passion. He's an expert in his field. He loves physics. He wants students to love and enjoy it as well. So he's bringing in different ways to think about it, different examples, and it's following what Mason desired for science, where it's bringing it in the historical connections, the chronological understanding of science in like how these discoveries came about, and it's bringing us to those people as well as to those ideas. So you get really the how did it get developed? Why do we have this piece now? How did we understand this? So that's interwoven throughout the text. So it's not only the physics and the problems and the doing the exercises and doing how does the math, doing the problems of that, solving the problems. It's also giving you that historical narrative going through. So adding the interest of these are real people, and real people discovered this, and new discoveries are being made all the time, and they need to be made going into the future. So that's kind of the basis of what's happening in the physics text. The same thing then moves on into biology, different authors, but equally passionate about their subject. And then going into chemistry, which is again also by John Mays. So it's there's experiments that go with it, right? So you've got the readings you're working through, you've got the problems and the math problems that tie into the physics that are in here, as well as then the experiments or the field studies that go along with these subjects. So you're both doing it, the reading work, but you're also doing the physical work of understanding it through experiments and through things that are being activities that you're doing outside. There's also there's a kind of a solutions manual that goes with it for the student as well. So like for the chemistry, there's a guide that then helps them to see, okay, how was this problem done? And where, if I didn't understand all of the pieces to it, then I can work through the solutions manual as the student and help myself to understand what did I miss, or where did I get it wrong, or, oh, okay, yeah, that's a different way to solve it. I didn't see that, and just learn. So these kind of work together. They're not cheating, right? If they're using the solutions manual, this is actually a way to learn. It's helping them to kind of grapple with trying it on their own and then going backwards if they're stuck, to work through, well, how did they solve it, and how does this work? You will find your students may be overwhelmed, right? If you're coming to science with the expectation that, oh, I should just be able to read this one time through and it's going to be, I'll just be able to narrate it really easily. Not the case, right? In a discipline study, that would be like reading a bunch of grammar and then expecting that you're just going to understand it perfectly because you've read the paragraph. So anything that's skill-based and has a progression to it like that, there's work to be done along the way so that you build your understanding. So it's not a once and done, right? So this is again where we see back to the beginning where we were talking about different methods to deal with different type of writing and different books. This is one of those ones where you might need to read it again. You might need to answer the questions. You might need to copy diagrams. You might need to follow examples and work it through with different numbers and then try the problem again. You might have to go back, like I said, and work through the solutions manual so that you can kind of teach yourself, okay, what was happening here and what did I not understand? And I need to go back to the text and see if I can now put those pieces together. So this is as the relationship is building with these areas, we're bringing different ways to help the student to engage with the material. Now, science is not you don't put it in a box and say, okay, now we've learned physics, as if that's the end of it. So the textbook as well will kind of push the limits, right? It'll kind of be pointing to the fact that there's more to learn and there's more, you can spend your life studying physics and you're still not going to know physics, as Mason talks about, right? We never would say, oh yeah, we've learned all there is about this subject. So that'll be a piece that will be, it's been there all along, but I think it comes maybe a little bit more to the forefront to realize that there's going to be things that we struggle with in trying to understand these disciplines, but that's okay. The point isn't for it to just all be easy. The point is we do our work in order to grow in our understanding. It's a growing relationship, and then we move on to the next thing, right? We struggle to the extent that we can grapple with it now, knowing that we will have opportunities to continue growing all the way along. So don't be discouraged if your student comes across something that's a little bit challenging, it's a little bit harder. You work through it as best you can, you understand it to the depth that you can. It's bringing in the math as well as they're learning that. And then you move on because there's review that's built in, and you're going to see this same idea in a different place, and it's going to kind of help you to go, okay, I think I'm seeing where this happened before. But you're also at the same time gaining a bigger perspective of these disciplines, right? So we're seeing the kind of the expansion of this understanding, and it's a broad topic. We have lots of areas to cover in all these different ones. So it's doing both. You're broadening your relationship, and your relationship's going deeper at the same time. We do have also a whole kind of a high school science library that's part of the curriculum, where students can pick from a whole range of science topics and find one that is of particular interest to them. So as they're working through this disciplinary study of these subjects, they can read an amazing book on tides or moon phases and you name it, all sorts of different topics that would then kind of keep that, if say physics isn't one of their favorite things, okay, fine, they're growing in that relationship. But at the same time, they can read a book about animal tracking, whatever, all different topics that they might really find fascinating. And it's just going to continue to grow their love of the natural world. So those are going hand in hand. We have a disciplinary study, but we also are reading books about all sorts of different things. And one of those examples too, for when we are going through the biology text, another one, a book that we do pair or that we do require is called The Fool and the Heretic. This is an amazing book. Two scientists with different perspectives demonstrate and model for us what does it mean to have a very respectful conversation while holding different views. How can we have a kind dialogue, and especially in this day and age, how do we share those ideas and opinions? We hold different views, and yet we can still have a respectful conversation about the topic. These guys do an amazing job at that. And so it's just same thing. This would tie into citizenship. This would tie into, right, like our understanding in English about how to speak well and communicate well, caring for words, again, crosses over. So science relating to citizenship, relating to current events, relating to Bible, right? It's like there's a interpenetration of all of these subjects at this level that you can't, if we drew a map, it would just be all intersecting lines, right? It would just show these disciplines all over the place.
Well, and it's all about that, she's talking about the broadening. It's all about growth, and the broadening doesn't stop just because you've graduated or just because you've matriculated to another grade, right? It goes on, it moves into this wide room, and that it's the growth that the grappling brings, and the dynamic that continues to move forward all through life. And exactly. that's what we're preparing students for, right? We're preparing for life, not for a grade or a particular situation. And that's what these students get all across the board.
Right. And so then that leads us, so now that we've worked through these three main disciplinary subjects, that these courses have been vetted by university professors, they have weighed in and been instrumental in thinking through the progression and how it's done. And so that this sort of 12th grade piece, we have decided to do more of an option, a smorgasbord, right? A potluck, where students now are developing their own interests in, well, what are they wanting to pursue in this area? Or maybe they have a different subject that they would like to look at. So we give several different options at this point that students can delve into at the grade 12 level. So one is looking at microbiology, and it uses a whole bunch of different books. Here's just one of them. I contain multitudes. Looking at the microbiome, right? This is a cutting edge idea that is in, you hear this on the news, right? Like this is current events, this is science, it's happening all around. So each of these courses, between astronomy, between microbiology, between botany, there's geology, they all have a multiple book component to them, as well as a field study component to them, as well as a citizen science component. So at this point, 12th grade, we're looking at, okay, how do we, Mason's idea of education for service, right? So this isn't just for ourselves, right? This is to be a blessing to others in the world. So how do we take what we're learning in one of these areas and then offer that as help to somebody else? So what can we involve ourselves in the citizen way, again, tying into citizenship again, and how can we take our study and make it available to others that are working on similar things? So each of these courses have a citizen science component that would come to play. So just a quick overview. Yeah, there's multiple books. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, that's just a pivotal book in this whole study of microbiology and what was going on. There's a lab component, like I said, to each of them. Some of the books in the geology course, there's a field guide to give our basic overview of the discipline once again, but then there's some fascinating components as well, that like here's 101 American geosites. So where do you live, right? And what's your geology, and how would you even go about learning about it locally? So there's a whole local section on, okay, what's near you, and let's go figure out what it is. So tying into that field studies. There's other ones that talk about just really good writers in the field. John McPhee is a amazing geology writer. He just has, it's been around for a long while, but he looks at the historical as well as just the geographical and the geology going through across the country. Like what basin and range, that's one of them, or suspect terrain. Like how do these areas, he's just, again, tying in the history, tying in the development and what's going on. But he's an amazing writer. So we want to see both the literature of the subject, right, as well as the field study component, as well as the discipline of understanding that subject, and again, broadening the range. So these courses, could be used in other grades as well, if there was an interest, if students wanted to pursue these different things, and depending on your school, where you are, what's going on. So take a look at these if you haven't before. There's a botany course that's in here that utilizes both the history, so the plant hunters. This is an amazing biography. There's a younger version that's used in the earlier grades, but this takes it to a different level. It's got looking at ferns. There's books on different ways that we would study. How do we understand plant families? How do we grow in our ability to identify plant families? So this is definitely a hands-on component, just amazing way to kind of see what would help us to identify these plants in the field, right? No matter where we live, what is this whole understanding of botany? Ones like that. There's great ones on trees and on seeing seeds. This is an amazing book that uses the current photographic abilities to just really delve into what do these components of seeds look like. It's amazing how it opens your eyes to what's all around you, but we just so easily walk by. So it's looking at that. It's
a wonder of creation.
Exactly. It's just amazing. Another one just talking about bringing our soil back to life. So again, tying into current issues, what's happening in our world today, and how does that relate to the whole study of botany, and what's happening, what are we doing, what's microbiology, right? These are overlapping ones as well. So things like that, as well as in astronomy. We've got 100 things to see in the night sky, right? So you're out there and learning and growing. Very accessible illustrated guide. It's got planets, it's got satellites, constellations, and just one by one, you're just working through it. It shows you where you can see it, how you can go about looking for it, how would you identify it. And nowadays, right, there's so many apps and great ways to utilize these things. So wanting to use technology wisely and well, these are some of the areas where that comes into play, as well as working through the astronomy talks about worldview. And there's a whole kind of a dovetail as you're learning about the astronomy. There's a dovetail understanding of worldview and asking questions, and how do we understand perspective? And again, going back to how do we have good dialogue? So that's kind of all put in there also. And that's an expanding category. We'd like to add a second year physics course. That's kind of in the works, to be able to students that are really interested in building on that introductory level that they did in 9th grade. If they want to carry that further in preparation for going to universities, then we hope to add a 12th grade second year of physics that would utilize the higher math as well, that they would be able to do then at that point. So, wow, this is a massive undertaking in trying to give a thorough overview of these 4 years in all these different subjects. So if you have stuff due to the end, wow, that's amazing. But we are very happy and excited to be able to show you these things and to kind of really give a, you can't really see on paper the way all of these things kind of dovetail and come together. So I hope in some way we have accomplished that task a little bit to show you sort of that interconnected way that so many of these things are just, yeah, it's about growth. Like we keep saying, it's a relationship that our students have that are just continuing on into these upper years as they grow in their abilities and in their understanding.
We're very excited. We hope you guys are too.